This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
We've got an hour and a half slot now for me to take you through the various aspects of the Festival in a Box project. And the way I want to do that is, I don't want it all just to be me banging on and kind of lecturing. Because there's so many people involved in the project and so many different partners, that I want to give everyone an opportunity to have their own say. So myself and Claudia Cooper, my co-investigator, are going to talk for about 45 minutes or so. And then I'm going to open up the floor and invite up some representatives of the various other collaborative partners involved in the project. And they are many. So we're going to have a representative from the Bloomsbury Festival, the box designer, one of the befrienders who's helped us with the scheme, and Tracy McDermott from Age UK Camden, who is the coordinator of the Dementia Befriending Service. So there should be an opportunity for a bit of a broader discussion at the end, and you can ask questions about different aspects of the project. Just to give you a bit of an overview of the project then, as I said at the start, it's a 9-month research project which has been run from the School of Advanced Study, which is based here in Senate House. It's come out of a kind of a long-standing collaboration that the school has with the Bloomsbury Festival, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. But the essential kind of idea, and people kind of keep sort of asking me, like, what's the box? You may have seen the box because the box is in the room next door. But the idea really is to take a peripatetic, miniaturised version of the Bloomsbury Festival in all of its kind of multidisciplinary extravaganza out into the homes of people who can't go to the festival. So, and in this instance, we've obviously been working with a very specific group of people, which is people with dementia, living in Bloomsbury, but also in the broader area of Camden. And we've been working closely with Age UK Camden and their Dementia Befriending Service to do that. We're at the end of the project now, in terms of the money that we've got. It never feels like you come to an end of a project. They always raise more questions, I think, than they do provide answers in some ways. So it feels quite active in my mind, and I'll say a bit more about that later on.
Before you move that, could you please explain the picture?
Yeah, this is a picture of a piece of artwork that was created for the Bloomsbury Festival in, I believe, 2012, which is before I was involved in the festival. But it's basically some paper doves. I believe that's in Russell Square. Okay? There's going to be a lot of pictures as we go through. So the objectives of the project. So we wanted to develop an outreach programme to bring cultural participation to socially isolated older people with dementia. Obviously not everyone who has dementia is socially isolated, but these are the people that we were working with. It's a pilot programme. We only had a short amount of time, and we only had quite a small number of participants. We had 6 people participating in the programme. As I said, we're working with Age UK Camden's Dementia Befriending Service, and we're evaluating the feasibility, acceptability and enjoyment of what we're doing. We wanted to make, if we could, a significant contribution to research methodologies in evaluating this type of activity. Specifically, we're interested in a multidisciplinary narrative framework. A narrative is a really core part of what we're doing. Again, I'll say a bit more about that as we move through. And to continue and develop collaborative relationships that have built up over the years, but also specifically through a previous research project which is actually what brought me to Bloomsbury in the first place last year, which was the Bloomsbury Festival Cultural Engagement Project. And again, I'll say a bit more about that. So our research questions, this is one of the participants in our programme. What is the core value of cultural engagement among people with dementia and living in isolation? That was kind of our starting point. Can participation in community-led cultural events lead to increased social inclusion, cognitive performance, social well-being? Using the intellectual resources of Bloomsbury. Again, this is quite an important aspect of the project. It's very much trying to kind of open up the resources in this kind of amazing area that we find ourselves in, and making a kind of active social use of them. Now, those were our kind of starting questions, but as we've moved through, I think increasingly there's a kind of a third question that has presented itself, which has become increasingly important, which is, what is the value of engaging people with dementia in the planning and provision of culture? And how might we better recognise people with dementia as a cultural resource in their own right? Again, I'll explain what I mean by that as we go through. Just a bit of background. The Bloomsbury Festival, I won't say too much about this because Paul Wyman, who's the chair of the Bloomsbury Festival, is at hand to say a few words afterwards. But it's a registered charity and an established community festival founded in 2007 in its current form as a celebration of the cultures, communities and histories of Bloomsbury and all those who live and work in the area. It's often forgotten that Bloomsbury is a residential area, and obviously it's an area which people pass through and work in, and which forms part of the daily lives of quite a large number of people actually. They describe themselves as an autumn festival of art, knowledge and imagination, which I think is lovely. But they've also described themselves as an avant-garde village fete, which I think is even more lovely. And they were the words of Kathy Major, who was the festival director last year, and who played a really important part in the initiation of the Festival in the Box project. Unfortunately, she can't be here today, but she's here in spirit, I hope. Just again on the background of the project, and again, I don't want to kind of spend too much time on this, but I think it's important to the conceptualisation and the shape of what we try to achieve. The cultural engagement project that I was involved with last year in Bloomsbury was essentially, I essentially programmed a series of events for the Bloomsbury Festival using academics and intellectual resources from the School of Advanced Study. The idea being to strengthen engagement between research and community, and to kind of blur the boundary really between the university itself and the civic milieu that surrounds it. It also involved a certain amount of questioning of the cultural narrative of Bloomsbury itself and the university's place within it. Now, Bloomsbury is an area which has a very specific, I think, cultural narrative, which is that people associate it with precisely what Veronica was talking about in a way, the elite culture, and the Bloomsbury set, and blue plaques, and the British Museum. And I think what part of that project was doing is to try and open up that narrative a bit more, and to question the kind of the roots of it, delving into histories and the current communities of the area. It also involved a certain amount of questioning of what a festival is. Don't worry too much about reading through all of these quotes, by the way, because I'll make the slides available afterwards. But I just want to give you some sort of flavour of some of the research that I was doing there. So I was really interested by this idea as festivals themselves as a kind of cultural text, what that kind of cultural text might break down into and what it might be made up of. This is just a quick quote from an article by Bernadette Quinn, and she's essentially saying there that festivals constitute areas where local knowledge is produced and reproduced, and where the history, cultural inheritance and social structures which distinguish one place or another can be formed and negotiated and renegotiated. And there can be places where you can connect more thoroughly with your local area, and which can kind of lead you to question your relationship with it. In case that sounds a little bit too hopeful and optimistic and utopian, she also points out that the construction of festivals is often useful for demonstrating divisions and who's left out of the party, if you like. So she says that the construction of festival practices is also intimately bound up with the cultural and social divisions that structure human population groups. And I think, in a sense, that is where the Festival in a Box project started off, really. So you have all of these kind of lovely, joyous photographs of festival activities, and we have to always be aware that there's someone missing from that picture and that narrative. So Kathy, in her time as Bloomsbury Festival Director, was very keen to assess who's missing from the narrative of the Bloomsbury Festival and how we might engage with them. And that's, I think, the point at which she initiated the conversation with Age UK Camden, to start to kind of think about how we can take the festival and extend it to people who are isolated within the community. Claudia, do you want to say a few words just about the befriending service?
The befriending service, right, yes. I'll just explain a little bit about who I am and why I was really pleased to get involved with this when Michael approached me. I'm Claudia Cooper. I'm a senior lecturer at UCL, working in dementia, and I'm also a consultant at Camden Memory Service within Camden and Islington NHS Foundation Trust. And the other doctors that I work with and me, we see about 700 to 800 people a year with dementia and mild cognitive impairment. We don't see everybody in our area with dementia. The Alzheimer's Society has done a lot of work looking at what proportion of people actually get access to secondary services in different areas. And they estimate we probably see about 75% of people with dementia in this area come through our doors. And what we do is we try to give the best services and access to the best facilities that are available. Unfortunately, at the moment, dementia doesn't have a cure. Despite enormous efforts from researchers and lots of money, the many drug trials results have so far been rather disappointing. What we are starting to realise is that we need to see people early, that when we do have curative treatments, they will be best given early before the disease process becomes too severe. And that's true across the board, really. There's been a big push nationally to see people with dementia earlier, when we can plan their care, when people are more able to access things that are going to help to slow the progress of the disease, and when symptomatic treatments are more useful. So what do we do with these 700 people that come through our doors, and who ends up in the dementia befriending service, who we work with closely? It's very nice to have been working with Tracy McDermott, who runs that in Camden, on this project. People who have a diagnosis of dementia, where drug treatments would benefit them symptomatically, we give them those treatments. Everybody is offered cognitive stimulation therapy. If you look at what predicts who gets worse quicker and who does better with dementia, we've just done a big review of the evidence, and it seems to be that if people who stay healthier, so people in whom diabetes is treated, cholesterol is treated, blood pressure is treated. People who have their health actively manage to do better. Interestingly, and this is another area that I'm really interested in research, people who eat better, who eat more of a Mediterranean diet, seem to do better. And in Camden, we've just introduced the first food groups for people with dementia, which I think is a first as an NHS service in the country. And also people who have more stimulation do better. And that's where this fits in. And so what we do is we offer people the treatments, we offer them the cognitive stimulation therapy, we offer them the food group, and we tell them all about the community resources, which includes Arts for Dementia, for example. But what we're really trying to do, and where this project is really important, is we're trying to stimulate people and get them re-accessed to the things that they enjoy, which is obviously enormously personal. And that is, in some cases, that is easy, in that people say, yes, I'd love to go to Arts for Dementia, and the carer says, yes, and I can take her, and that's easy. Often it's not easy. We work with a very multicultural population. For example, about 10 to 20% of the people we see don't speak English as a first language. That's a first barrier to getting stimulating activities. Many people have physical impairments and find it difficult to get out of the house. That's another barrier. A big barrier you hear is often from the carer, there's a pregnant pause when you say, what would you like to do? Would you like to join some of these groups? And the carer will often say, she's never been a joiner. I've heard that, I hear that several times a week. And that tells you that you've got, it's going to be a bit more challenging. And lots of people don't have a carer. I think it's very easy to talk about the carer. But who is the carer? Sometimes that's a really actively engaged, motivated daughter with a car who can take people to events. Often it's somebody who's the only person that person knows. I saw somebody with a carer who I assumed was her daughter the other week in clinic, and she said, actually, can I explain? This lady has been my mother's lodger for 20 years, and my mother was diagnosed with dementia, and now I've realised that her lodger also has dementia, so I'm looking after them both, and I'm also doing a full-time job. So carers don't always have the time or the resources, and sometimes the relationships have never been good, so it's not always easy to get people to stimulating activities. So thank goodness we have the Dementia Befriending Service, because when all else has failed, you better call the Dementia Befriending Service. When you have somebody who's never been a joiner, they have no one, they won't go out, they don't want to do anything, sometimes you can say, is there anything that you might do? And I was just mentioning in the group, this lady said to me the other day, she said, all I need is somebody to take me across the road to the Historical Research Society, where I did research for 30 years. We can have a coffee on the way if they want. But then I want to sit and I want to do some serious research. And they can sit and do serious research with me as well if they want. But that is what I want. That is my life. And I would like to get back to it as soon as possible. And I would be doing it now, except that I can't get across the road. And this lady, although she had a very poor short-term memory, she read sturdy philosophical texts and was still very active in this area. And that is what she wanted to do. She didn't want to go to a day centre, didn't want to take up a new activity. That is what she wants. So she's top of the waiting list, I think, at the moment, isn't she? So sometimes you can slot people into what's around, and sometimes it has to be very individual, because it's not a time in somebody's life when they want to put aside what they want to do and do what's available. And it's another issue which I absolutely agree with is somebody mentioned taxes. And if you work in dementia, taxes are huge. This is a very big issue. Last year, I'm taking too long to answer your question, but last year our trust spent £65,000 on taxes. But the reason that we are very successful at getting people to our cognitive stimulation therapy programme, and the trust funds that because that has the best evidence base. Now, there are lots of other things that seem to be successful, but when you're trying to get funding from a national body, there's nothing like a double-blind randomised controlled trial. It sounds terribly boring, but actually that is how you get access to things. And cognitive stimulation therapy is 10 sessions, it's orientation, it's active cognitively stimulating exercises, but most of all, it's a carefully and expertly facilitated group in a pleasant place with tea and coffee. It's a place where people come together, and we have the resources to send taxis, to help carers to get people there, to go and get people without carers, to send out our workers sometimes to actually bring people in and get people to a place where they can meet others. And that's hugely important. And I think that the reason it works, a bit like the singing, is it's probably not just the content of the sessions, it's probably being together, leaving the house. The fact that somebody bothered to come and get you, rather than just saying, oh, I'm sure there's somebody around that can take you. And when you've got people there for 10 sessions, our workers get to know them, and they can work out and be very sort of cunning sometimes about how they're going to use the limited resources we've got to get that person to something they want to go to. And that's one of the biggest things that cognitive stimulation therapy does. I think you've been in some of the groups, haven't you, Marika? Is it's about that linking up, and it's about thinking about where does this person want to go and how are we going to get them there. And we have our workers in the memory service sit with an enormous bank of leaflets about different services. There are so many different language and cultural groups that we work with to try and make sure that it's not just the people with the active carer and the money and the English that get what's needed for dementia, but it's everybody. And the dementia befriending service just helps to reach people that other things don't reach. And what I love about this project is that it uses that service to try and bring culture to these people who are a group who would never go to the Bloomsbury Festival. Nobody would ever take them to a museum. They've got nobody. They've got no facility for getting out and doing things by themselves. And we did only see 6 people, but they were perhaps 6 of the most isolated people in this borough. And it's really wonderful to hear, as you will, when I stop talking, about how they engaged in this study. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. Yeah, I think this is a really good point as well. I mean, Claudia was just talking about a woman who's still very keen on doing active and rigorous research herself, but who has dementia. And I think from the outset of this project, it was always going to be about what we can learn from our participants as much as taking culture to them. And I think in the early stages of conceptualising what this box might be, that was quite a key point, actually. And it occurred to us, as we were having early discussions around this, that as well as being a kind of a box full of cultural delights which goes out to people, maybe this box could be a kind of archive. And in an area which has the highest concentration of libraries anywhere in the country, and which has the British Museum just across the corner, the Senate House Library just upstairs, the British Library, etc. Could we initiate a new archive, basically, based around our project, which would enable and empower people to tell their stories about the area? And when we talk about Bloomsbury here, we're not just talking the strict geographic area, which is, as I'm sure you all know, is this square here between Gray's Inn Road, Theobald's Road, Tottenham Court Road and Euston Road. We're interested in how that area is informed by the broader social fabric of London and Camden. So it's an opportunity, I think, or it was always conceived as an opportunity for people with dementia to participate in reforming how we think about Bloomsbury and how we think about the history of the area. How that might relate to a broader research context on dementia, I think there's an increasing focus on the importance of stories and narratives. when working with people with dementia. And I think that breaks down into three key areas that I'm going to come back to. Why might it be useful for people with dementia to tell their stories? Well, it's an opportunity to foster personhood, which obviously, as we all know, is a very key concept in dementia care. It's a therapeutic and cathartic thing in itself to tell your story. It creates you as a person. It's also an opportunity for us to challenge the narrative of dementia itself. Dementia tends to be something which is portrayed as a kind of catastrophe, a kind of cultural plague. It's often talked about as a kind of time bomb which is waiting to explode, and a lot of the kind of discourse about dementia is inherently problematic in itself, I think. This is an opportunity perhaps to change that. Also, I think this again is a really interesting point, but hearing the stories of people with dementia is an opportunity to change how we think about stories. Okay, so people who have the condition don't necessarily narrate their stories in the most conventional forms, and that I think is something which is very valuable in all sorts of ways. So this quote that I've pulled out, I mean, they said it tends to upset the often implicit and taken for granted narrative norms of the researcher. Yep, that happened to me, I would say, definitely. And I think it's a really valuable part of what we've been doing. I'm going to come up for air a bit now. So this is so that was in essence that was the proposal that we put to the AHRC. Can we have some money, please, to do that? And luckily, fantastically, they said yes. So we then moved to planning out a kind of project timeline. Just quickly take you through what that was. We had an early stage of research and development and recruitment, in which we recruited the participants to the study via Age UK Camden. We developed a questionnaire for them so that we could get a sense of people's existing cultural interests, to try and match up as best we could the kind of the outreach to the person. We cleared the ethics and started the process of the box design, which amazingly Andrew is here to tell us more about afterwards. We also had an outreach at the Bloomsbury Festival itself. Now, the Bloomsbury Festival last year was in October. It was the 15th to the 20th of October. And we thought, what an amazing opportunity to raise awareness of our project, but also of the befriending scheme, but also to do something which might feed into the conceptual framework of the project, which I'll talk about more in a sec. We launched a project blog, which I've been updating. Please do feel free to read it. And we recruited a research assistant, Catherine Lord, who, again, unfortunately can't be here today because she's taking a very well-deserved holiday. But she was a very key part of the project, actually. We then moved on in November to the visits themselves. As I say, we had 6 participants in the end, and they had between 3 and 4 weekly visits. Laura Halliwell from the Bloomsbury Festival helped us coordinate those. Then we did some follow-on interviews. We decided to interview the befrienders and the artists involved with the project as well. And we did our collective and group readings and dissemination, which is where we are now. I'll just say something quickly about the first outreach that we did, because this was important to me in terms of how we thought about the project. We ran a workshop, an exhibition over the 2 busiest days of the Bloomsbury Festival. This was out in Russell Square, which has a footfall of tens of thousands of people over the weekend. as I said, it was an opportunity for us to raise awareness of the project and to raise awareness of the befriending service. But it was also an opportunity to create a resource for the project. And for me, it comes back to that idea of what the narrative of the festival is, and the festival as a text. I wanted to get a narrative snapshot of the festival over its 2 busiest days. What we did for that, we had some forms for people to fill in, which asked people to note down what they're hearing, what they're smelling, to donate resources. But we also had this interesting question that we put out to people where it said, tell us an interesting story about your day. And again, it comes back to the greater story of the Bloomsbury Festival. But we got some fantastic... I'm skimming the surface of what we got. But I just thought I'd pull out one fantastic example of that, which was a woman in her 80s who had lived her life in the area and her working life in the area. He used to go to the Egyptian mummy room in the British Museum to keep warm in the 50s because it was so cold in their office building. And I just thought that was fantastic. And I thought that was one example among many of the forms returned of how we can start to break apart this kind of broader narrative into its constituent parts, some of which are quite unexpected and quite challenging. Over this same period, we're obviously wrestling with the all-important issue of the box design. I don't know if anyone noticed, but the box is in the next room on the table. Please don't spill coffee on it. So we started off with the idea of having a separate box for each participant so that it can become, as I say, a personal archive. But as our sort of thinking develops on that, we decided to go for a slightly different concept, which is to have an interlinking series of separate boxes, which will come together into a kind of coherent whole. And this is if the link works, this is a little... maybe that's not going to work. But you've seen the separate boxes as separate drawers, but it links together into one box. We have a top layer for kind of materials, a second layer for storing our equipment, our recorder and things like that, and then a third layer which was each person's individual archive. And for each visit we'd add something to that, and it built up over time. I'm still thinking about the link. Okay, so we then obviously got on to the visits themselves. We recruited a number of artists from the Bloomsbury Festival programme who would go out with the box. And we decided on the basic structure of what we would do. Reflecting, obviously, the research team that we had, we decided that I didn't actually introduce myself in terms of my academic background, did I? But I'm a literary and cultural critic by training, but I have also worked previously in arts and health as well. Obviously, my focus is very humanities, very literary, whereas Claudia obviously is much more a doctor, exactly. A medical doctor, a doctor of philosophy. There you go. So I think that the structure we came up with reflects that. We decided to have both a quantitative and qualitative element to what we were doing. So at the start of the session, we took a single measure, a single question happiness measure, And Claudia, I don't know if you want to say a few words about that.
Yes, I mean, it's not the most interesting part of the project, but with something like this, which is a pilot project, obviously you've got to have one eye to, if it's successful, how you might take this on to a larger study and how you might develop the evidence base that would be needed to persuade funders that this is something that could be rolled out to everybody. Because it's not a success if only 6 people ever get this intervention. So we were pretty much agreed across the team that qualitative methodology, so asking people to tell their stories and asking their thoughts about what had been successful about the project, was going to be the main part of our evaluation. But because if you do a larger study, there would be an impetus perhaps to put a quantitative measure on, to ask somebody to rate their experience. We just thought we would ask our 6 participants to rate just one question at the beginning and at the end of the intervention how they were feeling. And that was to see whether or not the results that we got felt meaningful, because obviously we had a lot of information from each of our 6 participants about how they felt about the intervention, and they were pretty positive, really, weren't they? And we just wanted to see whether or not a quantitative measure would reflect that, whether that might be something that we could use in future studies. We weren't going to analyse it because you can't get any meaningful quantitative data from 6 people, but you can perhaps get some sense of whether or not what that person was telling you in numbers reflected what they were telling you in words. Do you want me to go on to the results or stop there?
No, carry on.
The results didn't really. People told us in words how much they'd enjoyed the activity, but the question we asked was about their overall happiness right now. We kept it to one question because we wanted to prioritise the qualitative questions, and we didn't want to take up too much airtime really and turn this into a questionnaire event. So we just stuck to one question. Taking all things together, how would you say you are these days? Very happy, fairly happy, not very happy, or not too happy? Just 3 actually. Not very happy or not too
Sorry,
happy.
typo.
Yeah. So it was just 3. And what tended to happen was that people told us they'd really enjoyed the activity, it had been great, they'd really got involved, but actually they felt about the same level of happiness after as before, because, you know, whatever you're worrying about at the time, it's really nice to be diverted from it, to do some ceramic printing or so on. But it doesn't really change perhaps your underlying woes or joys in life, and that was the same for the participants as probably it would have been for us. So what we've taken away from that, I think, is if we do decide to go on and do a larger study, we'll have to think more carefully about how we use quantitative measures and what we're asking, and what we think is likely to change. Yes.
I didn't feel. I think you should have asked my bloke, how are you feeling right now? He went back to the sort of more general thing. I don't think he was asked right now, because he immediately afterwards he said he really enjoyed it.
Yes.
But
I wonder whether actually in future we need to look at scales that, you know, what do we expect this to do? We expect this to be something that people enjoy, and that they found satisfying, and I think probably we need to think about asking those questions more. But yes, it's a good point also about thinking about the time zone that we're asking them about.
Yeah, I think absolutely, and I think, you know, as we're sort of talking about it, there are other measures out there, I think, which we could maybe look at if we were doing this again, and I think we'll probably hear some more about that this afternoon from some of the speakers. The narrative interview we kept very simple, and what we found actually is that the engagement in itself, the whole session, became a narrative interview, really. And we decided very quickly that we needed to record and transcribe the whole visit, and then later analyse that as a complete text in its own right. So just to give a sense of the different activities, this afternoon we're going to have a feedback panel from the artists, so they will be able to speak personally about the types of things that they did and what they thought about it. But we had a really broad range, and we tried to reflect the Bloomsbury programme in that. So we had poetry and literary activities, which tended to have an element of facilitated reminiscence to them. We had hands-on activity, ceramics, towel making, wallpaper making, tended to be led by Anastasia, who's here today. We had music, so we had singing, jamming with instruments. We had some photography sessions which were quite interesting. And again, we had storytelling of various different kinds, whether literary or oral. I said before, we decided that, I mean, looking at this box, it's really not just the kind of box of an individual, it's a box of a kind of community, really, in a way. And we wanted to get as many of the perspectives of the people involved in the project formally included in that. So we interviewed 4 befrienders and 5 artists who've been involved in the project. And the technique for that interview is that we had the kind of archive box present, so it was a way of reminiscing, and also a way of kind of including a kind of embodied aspect to the interviews. Analysis. So we read the transcripts individually and then as a team. So we had meetings. Again, the boxes themselves are present at those meetings, along with pictures and other materials from the visits. We had a group reading of the befriender and artist transcripts. As Claudia was just saying, we looked at the happiness measures and we analysed those as far as they go. In terms of our strategy of reading transcripts, these are really informed by narrative inquiry methodologies, but we also drew upon some principles from IPA, which, again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's essentially a way of trying to recognise the person underlying the narrative, but also that the research process itself contains a kind of subjective and embodied element. We're also quite heavily influenced by the idea of signature stories, and again, I think this goes back to the idea of the festival and the area itself as a story and as a narrative. We were looking out for, well, I'll just read out this quote actually. Signature stories are those narrative units, those noteworthy episodes that we've told on a variety of occasions and what some would call set pieces in our developmental journey. And we were looking for, again, that kind of three-strand thing of different types of stories. So this was signature stories of people's lives, signature stories of people's condition, and signature stories of their lives and memories of the area, and of course of the engagement process itself. The archives are out there. Please do feel free to have a look through them. I just want to, there is a real wealth of material in them, not least in terms of people's transcripts. But I just want to kind of give you a very brief snapshot of some of the contents. So I've taken out some quotes, but also some of the other materials. I think that one thing that's becoming really clear to us is that these archives have to be read as a text in themselves, rather than just focusing on the transcripts. So, as Claudia was saying, we got a lot of people talking about the personal value of culture to them and their lives in culture. We found that a lot of people who engaged with the project had a long history of cultural involvement, working in the arts themselves. But also people talked about how they're in quite a kind of rich and evocative way of how their involvement in culture had been changed by their experience of dementia. So one of our participants had always been involved in creative writing, but had stopped doing that at the present moment, and that was the only time in his life that he hadn't been writing. There was a wealth of descriptive knowledge about dementia itself. So the top two quotes are particularly interesting, I think, in that sense. These were from someone who had suffered a stroke and who actually can't talk very much, but nonetheless came up with some very interesting metaphorical kind of ways of talking about his own condition. We asked the question, how did it make you feel? And the responses we got to that were quite revealing, I think, and quite rich again. I really like this one, which is from one of our participants, who again is that kind of active intellectual person who challenged us and said that if she was to talk about it in psychoanalytic terms, she'd be able to give us a richer answer, perhaps. Now, in terms of memories of Bloomsbury, Camden and London, these I think are some of the more interesting things that came out. We got an incredible selection of kind of personal oral histories of people's lives in the area. Not all of them specifically about Bloomsbury, but about the surrounding kind of context as well. So Soho, Camden generally. And I think, in a way, for me, these are some of the most valuable things that we found, actually. And these are the things that I think can be really put to use in the future. I love this one. This is from someone who has lived since 1940s in a flat just next to the British Museum, and taught her family to walk in the King's Library. People were also keen to kind of narrate the changes in their community and their sense of where they are in it, and often, understandably given our kind of demographic, this was a narrative of kind of cultural isolation, social isolation, and change in the community, or perceived change, how they perceived their kind of embeddedness or not in the local context. And these are people, obviously, who've lived here for kind of 40, 50, 60 years. Again, we had this kind of second wave, as I say, and the artist and befriender perspectives were also a really interesting and valuable part of the kind of archive that was built up over the course of the project. There's a number of themes here which I don't really have time to go into, but I really love this quote with someone talking about the unexpected connections that are made as a result of projects like this. It's a kind of way of throwing ideas of kind of who you can relate to and who forms a community or social group. It throws that into question a bit. So he says that's one of the things I get from the Bloomsbury thing. Like when you think about these artists, me, you, the participant, really unlikely people to come together and share something amazing. That gives me a lot of hope, and it's something that I think I take away from it. I want to kind of twin that with something that one of the artists said, which again I thought was really revealing given the conceptual grounding of the project. He was saying that as an artist, as a kind of creative practitioner, it made him think again about how he relates to cultural activity and what he does. And interestingly, he said unprompted that a lot of his work is about storytelling. And he said, it seems to me like all the best work that I do is about storytelling, and it's made me ask myself questions about what my story was that I wouldn't have necessarily done otherwise. So it's a way of getting a new perspective on what people do. Sorry, I'm skipping ahead now because I'm conscious of time. In terms of lessons learned, I think we learn any number of practical lessons about how and how not to undertake art activities with people with dementia. I'm hoping that the artist panel this afternoon will give people a chance to talk about that in a bit more detail. Evaluation, well, we've talked about that, quantitative versus qualitative. We found that for what we were doing, given the routing of the project in narrative, we found that qualitative was the most valuable and most appropriate in this instance. But again, I think this afternoon we're going to hear a couple of different perspectives on evaluation, working with people with dementia, which will be very interesting. We learned a lot about collaboration and how working with various stakeholders, various research methodologies can feed into something really kind of rich but also quite complex. And I think we found out something useful about the nature, value and possible future uses of the Festival in a Box archive itself and what it might become. I just want to say a few words about that by way of a conclusion. I think that what we have out there on the table is an archive which can be put to use. I think it's an archive resource for telling people stories, but also a way of making and unmaking narratives. I think it's a means of ethically and sensitively engaging with the stories of people living alone with dementia in Bloomsbury, and a way of hopefully working those back into the fabric of how we think about that community. And I think that that is something which, if we do it properly in the future dissemination of the project, could provide a usefully kind of defamiliarising and estranging perspective on the area. One of the things that you might learn, and this is particularly a lesson for people planning art festivals, is that people have had the same ideas before and they've got a completely different perspective and take on that, which is useful. So one of the things that we found out through conversations with our participant, one of our participants, is that there had already been a Bloomsbury Festival, the Bloomsbury Fair, which was active in the late 60s and 70s. And the way that she talked about that as an exercise in bringing the community together was very, very useful. And strangely, it was also the exact same design on the flyer, more or less, which the Bloomsbury Festival came up with for their 2013 flyer. So it's a way of reworking perhaps the area and the Bloomsbury Festival via a perspective taken from some of its best established but most vulnerable residents. But I think in order for it to be useful, we have to look at ways of continuing to open up the archive. It's not doing much use if it's just sitting in my office. I'll say a bit more about that in a sec. I also think that what we've got in there is possibly a way of defamiliarising the narrative discourse that we have about community at the moment. And I think we're entering into a kind of a phase where dementia is very, very much rhetorically present and spoken about, but not necessarily in the most constructive way. And I think that there's a lot of discursive kind of concepts around here which need to be interrogated and spoken about in a bit more depth. So I'm particularly interested in this kind of idea of dementia-friendly communities, which is being promoted as something that people can sign up to and commit to creating. I think that one of the most valuable conclusions for me, I think, which has come out as someone who works with festivals quite a lot, is that a community arts festival that properly and ethically engages with people with dementia could make a significant contribution to how we think about that very concept. What does it mean to be a dementia-friendly community? Does that mean anything at all? How can we make it mean something? So in terms of opening up the archive, making it accessible, making sure that some of the wealth of what's in there, and as I say, I'm really only scraping the surface. We've got images, texts, various materials in there. We've got the formal things that we need to do as part of the project. So this is one of them. We're having this Knowledge Share Day. We're submitting the final report to the AHRC, and that will be publicly available. There's a journal article being prepared, which should hopefully go into Medical Humanities Journal. The project blog is still active. But also, we're hoping for a future. So, with Age UK Camden, we're developing a Festival in the Box training toolkit that hopefully will be of use to other people who want to run arts activities of this nature. We're going to make this material available for the Bloomsbury Festival's analysis, which they're currently undergoing. So the strategic review of the charity is ongoing, and we're hoping that some of the material from this project can go into that. There will be a Festival in the Box exhibition as part of the Being Human Festival of the Humanities, which is coming up in November. But also I'm keen to digitise these archives and make them more publicly accessible. The website by which I'm going to do this is still under construction, but I just want to give you this isn't going to work now, is it? Oh no, there you go, that one worked. Yeah, so I want to create a digital home for this, the Open Archives website, whereby some of the, where ethically appropriate of course, some of the materials which have been gathered during the project will be made available, the activity forms that people filled in as part of the Bloomsbury Festival, and the photographs. There's even some little bits of short film which have come out. And I see this as a growing archive that people will contribute to, hopefully, which again will build up a rich, multifaceted narrative of Bloomsbury. Will there be more visits? Well, we hope so. We need to obviously make sure that we have funding in place to do that. But I think we're at a stage now where we've done the pilot and we feel like we're much better prepared to do something on a bigger scale, and we're hopeful that this is going to be something that continues. There's a lot of people to thank in this project. Obviously the project collaborators and partners, so the Bloomsbury Festival, thank you. Age UK Camden, massive thanks to Age UK Camden, who've been spectacular. University College London, Claudia and Catherine, and everyone else who's been involved, many of whom have been giving up their time for no financial reward. If you've got any further questions about the project, then I'm very happy to circulate these slides after the talk. Please do feel free to drop me an email. And I often tweet about the project, so you can follow me there too. Okay, thank you very much. So I think we'll take just 5 minutes just for questions from me and Claudia, and then I'll invite up some other panel members of people who've been involved in the project, who can maybe answer questions about various different aspects of it. So, does anyone have any questions?
Can I just ask one question about the nature of how participants came forward? I know that there was some discussion at the beginning about referrals. Perhaps I'm not meaning to throw a spanner in the works because I'm looking at that and thinking what a fantastic project that is. But I suppose I'm also thinking about the use of the word narrative and thinking about how we work with people with higher levels of dementia, specifically not through narrative,
Sure.
but through abstract and also through embodied memory and not through vocabulary.
Sure, yeah. No, absolutely, that's a really, really good question. I mean, I think...
Not me throwing it, but I'm just intrigued because it's always the issue of how people are referred, which
Yeah.
is so crucial, really.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that is a really good question. I mean, I think for this project, we decided when we were recruiting that we had obviously to kind of approach people who had capacity to give consent. And because it's quite a complex project in some ways, and particularly because it's a pilot, we wanted to be quite careful about that. So we did work mainly with people who were earlier stages, I guess, or who were, what's the way of saying it?
Well, they may have had a diagnosis of mild or moderate dementia, but Tracy sort of thought about who might like to take part, really, didn't you?
Yeah, and it was put out to all of the befrienders because they're the people who work with our client base the most, and some have been befriending for quite some time, and so I was surprised that some didn't come forward, who I thought might, and I think that's partly because it was such a personal thing to go and visit somebody in their home, but it was asking befrienders to do the work about whether they would, be, willing to broach the subject with the person they visit, and if they were interested, then we could then start a conversation about how that might work.
Yeah.
The boxes that you made, do people now have their own boxes in their homes and they keep, or do they sit on the desk?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. I mean, the archived boxes are currently with me, and that is something that, again, we've had conversations about how would be the best way to get the materials back to people. What we've been trying to do is give people the kind of material outputs of the activity that they were doing. So in the tile making workshop, for example, they would keep the tile and add a kind of add something to the box as well. But I think it would be really nice if we could find a way of kind of getting the box back to people as well once it's been properly kind of documented and digitised. Yeah.
I should think that's very important. Only a couple of days ago, by chance, I came across a portfolio of stuff that I'd done at school, drawings of animals at the London Zoo, and I thought, my goodness, did I once do that, And it's wonderful to be able to look back and remember.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What are your plans for having people engage with the archive itself as something to actually use as a resource, or actually go and explore? How are you planning to do that? Or do you have any plans yet?
I mean, these are sort of plans which are in development at the moment. I mean, I think that hopefully this will be something that when the website is properly up and running, that can be something which becomes a kind of one-stop resource for a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about. So we kind of hopefully not just the kind of the pictures and bits and pieces of narratives, but also kind of project reports and all the rest of it that people can go to there as a kind of one-stop shop. It's also something, obviously, that, I mean, we plan to disseminate further and investigate kind of contexts in which we can disseminate further. So it'd be something that I'd really like to go out and talk to people involved in the planning of festivals about directly, because I think that it's very important when this is part of my other job, is that I help plan festivals, but I think it's very important to think about what they are and what they do, rather than just people having a good time. I think it's important that's done in quite a kind of rigorous conceptual way.